Hey everybody, Alex here for Nerdy Inc. I'm coming at you with something very different this week. You may also be confused if you're not watching this on my channel as to why I'm giving an introduction, so I guess we'll get to the explanation as to why you're hearing a strange person's voice if you're watching this on Review Anything. Basically, I'm doing sort of a collaboration with my good friend Steve from Review Anything. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
So half of you know Steve and half of you don't, depending on where you're watching this video. But we're basically just, we both went to college together and we both studied film together. And we decided to just sort of talk about the state of the movie industry. Talk about some of the trends we see and why those trends excite us or make us nervous. I don't really have a whole lot of other cool introductions to say other than, yeah, we're here and we're doing this. So I guess, Steve, do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
Okay. So I have basically four main trends that I see in the film industry, and they get more and more obscure. So I'm going to start with the most obvious ones. And the most obvious ones, and when it comes to blockbusters, is this idea of building a universe.
Mm-hmm.
That was started by Marvel in 2008. Basically taking the idea of a franchise and making it the next step of a franchise, which is making all of these different movies all intertwine. And so now we're seeing it with Marvel, and now DC is sort of expanding on that as well. They're making their own cinematic universe. Sony is trying to do it with their Spider-Man properties. Fox is trying to do that with the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and Deadpool. It's spilling over into TV now because there's word that we're getting a Walking Dead spin-off, which is just more Walking Dead, same universe, more zombies.
Great.
Yeah.
That's what everybody ordered.
The idea of a spin-off or prequel isn't too. That's not a new thing, but they're making, with Better Call Saul, from what I understand of it, they're going to be sort of tying that in a little bit closer to Breaking Bad than just a random spin-off. There's going to be some very direct ties to Breaking Bad in there. So I guess I want to talk about why the idea of a universe excites me and why it's sort of getting old at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the best thing about it is that you get these characters that are they're so much more fleshed out and so much more in depth than if they had just been in a normal movie or even just a series of movies. I like the fact that the events of the Avengers had an impact on Iron Man 3, and I like how coming up in Captain America 3 we're going to get more Iron Man, and these seeds have been planted not just in previous Iron Man and Cap movies, but in the Avengers. And I'm sure in Avengers 2 we're going to get quite a bit of that as well. So I like the fact that we're getting these characters, these stories that transcend different movie titles. And we're getting these characters that are you can see how all of these things beyond the one movie is affecting the characters and affecting, their decision making. And that's great because you're watching as a whole, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's the one I'm citing because that's obviously the one that's the most polished up at this point. That's the one we're furthest along in. This story there's a clear story that's transcending all the movies. So you don't have to. The Winter Soldier is not a sequel to the first Avenger. It's a sequel to the last movie that he was in, which was the Avengers. Or you can even say that it's a sequel to Thor: The Dark World. So I think that's really cool because you're watching basically a really nice, really polished TV show in the movie theater because you're having this story that's super ongoing and you're getting all of these characters that are crossing paths. So I really like the idea of the universe, and I like the fact that lots of people are trying to do it. The major con with that, however, the big drawback is that a lot of people are trying to make a universe and they just have no business making a universe whatsoever. Sony recently announced that they're trying to make a universe site model for Robin Hood. And to me, that's just completely absurd. Because Robin Hood, I don't know anyone.
That sounds unnecessary.
Yeah, I don't.
That just sounds unnecessary.
I don't know anyone who loves Robin Hood to a degree that they want to watch.
Mm-hmm.
I want to watch the Robin Hood movie, and then I want to watch the Sheriff of Nottingham movie, and I want to see how those two cross paths in the next whatever their crossover movie would be.
I think the regards to building a movie universe has a lot to tie into also the changes in television now, because everything's definitely way more serialized than I think it was even 10 years ago, especially with Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones. Everything is just one big extended story that lasts, across so many seasons. So it makes sense to me that movies are also sort of capitalizing on that by finding ways to expand their lore and overall runtime by having all sorts of these movies. So I think it's kind of interesting that they're sort of running parallel television and movies, and they're kind of intersecting. And then you have other stuff like they're talking about Dark Tower movies combining a movie series with like a TV series that is just like it's like they need as much screen time as possible to like get as much of this world and universe in there at the same time. And even like now Star Wars, where you're hearing the same thing, where we're talking about spin-offs already for 7, 8, 9, and like other individualized stories. So everybody's sort of latching on to that idea.
Right. It's funny because Star Wars is so... I don't think people even realize that that's what we're getting. We're getting a whole another Star Wars universe, and that beyond 7, 8, and 9, we're getting the spin-off movies, which haven't been officially announced, but I think there was a leaked list that featured something about Boba Fett, and I think we had either Han Solo or Yoda, I don't remember which one, and then we had Red 5, which is really random to me that we get him, but he's on there, I think. And then, but they're also, now they've had the Clone Wars shows that just ended, and then Disney started up with Rebels maybe a couple weeks ago. So yeah, there's definitely that crossover now between TV and movies as well, because we're getting a Star Wars cinematic galaxy. I'll call it that, universe. I like calling it the galaxy. But I actually wrote down too. It's funny that you mentioned. I wrote down the blurring of lines between TV and movies because TV used to be very episodic. Just sit down for a week, watch this, story of the week, and then next week you could watch something and be completely different and almost irrelevant to the last thing that you saw. In that TV was almost 1 hour long versions of movies, just very short movies, and then TV got very these
cinematic.
Yeah, cinematic.
That's kind of the way to put it.
Yeah, and they had these stories that spanned at episodes. And it's funny to me now that movies are responding back to that, which is now the movies are now serializing their stories almost like a TV show again.
I think it's funny how also, like you mentioned, like hour-long movies and stuff like, I don't know if you watch Hannibal on NBC.
I do not.
It's incredible. It is really good.
I've heard it's very good.
I thought it was going to be like a cash grab thing. It's one of the best television series I've ever seen. But definitely, it's all serialized for the most part, with the exception of 1 or 2 episodes. But talking about, it still somehow manages to maintain that like every episode is its own movie still, while having and it's I think that has a lot to do with bringing in different directors and stuff, and they have their own style, so everything feels different even though it's telling the same story. So that's just kind of a unique thing on there. And even like you go back to old school stuff like The Sopranos, which was all serialized. Every once in a while you get in an episode that just felt like its own concise, sort of story while maintaining the serialized nature. That's also where TV is sort of going.
So it's funny how the two are sort of responding back and forth to each other. The other thing that's really cool is how Netflix is also, if there's anything that's blurring the lines between TV and movies, Netflix is totally doing that, because TV, even if the story was an ongoing story, it's still stuck to a very traditional TV format, which was, introduction / recap to remind people what happened in last week's episode, introduce the story, then end with a cliffhanger or plot twist or whatever, so that way people would tune in next week. And Netflix is not doing any of that at all. There's no recaps in their episodes. Sometimes there's a decent cliffhanger. Other times it's just said, yeah, this is where we decided to just stop this episode and just start the next one. And people they don't need to hook people with like a mystery, because they know people can watch the episode right after that because it's right there.
Immediately. Yeah. There's no waiting. Come back
so
next
Netflix
week.
is like the super middle ground between TV and movies.
I like what they've been doing.
I'm super excited for Daredevil. They're releasing 4 TV shows for Marvel. Yeah. And in in an interview during New York Comic Con, Charlie Cox, the guy who plays Matt Murdock, basically said that this is structured to be a 13 or 14, however many episode hour movie. And he said, he's coming off of Boardwalk Empire, where it still was a TV format. He said this was a lot more free flowing, and it works more as a movie, which is awesome because Daredevil is my favorite hero, and that means I get to see more of him than anyone else currently in Marvel. One of the other things I wrote down here, and this is mostly just because Game of Thrones is fresh in my brain, the idea of these high fidelity adaptations is great to me because Game of Thrones is doing a very good job at pleasing its book fans and staying true enough, at least, to the books that the fans are happy. I know there are some changes.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see.
But as it stands right now, a lot of book readers are very pleased with the show. I don't really hear a lot of complaints that they changed this, they changed that. I've never read the books. Sorry, I'm a bad person because I don't read books.
It's a good dynamic. I've read the books, you haven't.
Yeah, there we go. Game of Thrones, I think, is setting the new standard for adaptation, in that I don't think movie studios now can even really get away with changing this is the books, because people they like seeing correct, I guess, story on screen. And I think that with Game of Thrones doing a very good job adapting the story, I think both The Hunger Games and Catching Fire are very good adaptations of the book. I just don't think that studios can get away with doing anything less than a good job. And I think that's great to see, because I think you're going to get a lot in the next coming years. We're going to get a lot of really good books that are translated into TV shows and movies because they realize they have no choice but to stay true to the source material. But I guess the one other point I want to make in terms of these high fidelity adaptations, there's a book out by Stephen King. It's a fantastic book. I don't know if you've read it. It's called 11/22/63.
I'm familiar with it. I haven't read it though.
It's basically it's a story about a guy who goes back in time to stop the JFK assassination. It's a very long book, but it's very, very good. Very well written, got a great story, and it never really slows down for me. I blew right through it. And it was recently announced that Hulu is going to be adapting that into a mini-series.
Oh.
And so I think that I'm citing this because I just want to seem like I'm correct. This is my support, is that this goes right in line with saying that if they had tried to turn that into a movie, it would have been just awful. They would have had to cut easily a third to a half out of that book just to make it even remotely filmable. And so I like the fact that this is the sort of the trend that we're taking towards mini-series as a way, or just full-fledged series as a way to tackle really long narratives.
Like, it's the same thing with Game of Thrones, when George R. R. Martin was kicking that around, and it's like, oh, we should do a movie, but movies would not be enough. If you'd have to do like 3 separate movies per book, with the amount of material, it's just the sheer length. So yeah, I think that definitely kickstarted it. And it's funny, it's the same way, like when Lord of the Rings came out, it was originally, I think, going to be 2 movies, and then George Lucas, Peter Jackson was like, no, this needs to be longer. So the studio was very reluctant to give him, the 3 movies that they needed, because it's sort of unprecedented. You've never gone right out and just said, okay, yeah, go ahead and make 3 movies.
You have a whole
if the first one
franchise to play
tanked,
with.
you're like, now you're screwed.
Right.
So like, even stuff like Star Wars, like obviously it was, the first one was just called Star Wars because there was no series at that point. Then it was like, okay, we'll call that A New Hope and then make the next one, as opposed to Lord of the Rings, which sort of broke through with this, like, yeah, okay, we'll give you all the, here you go. Here's the funding for all 3 movies. And then you're going to go on and see that with Harry Potter. And now you're seeing it with stuff like freaking Avatar, which is like, yeah, we have 5 movies planned now, from before one of them's even out, So, and I think the Game of Thrones book adaptation is sort of gonna do the same thing now, where people are more willing, like, it's chancy to base a whole TV show on one, book or one series, because if it tanks, like, you're done, and you have all that source material that's just it's 10 hours, it's not one movie.
Right.
So, but now that is extremely successful and that formula works, you're definitely going to see that, and miniseries too. I mean, you've got True Detective, you've got Fargo, you've got, all this other sort of stuff that's doing really well
Hmm.
right now. People like extended storytelling.
And I think I was reading somewhere, well, because right now Warner Brothers is announced that they're going to be doing spin-off movies of Harry Potter based on the other.
The Fantastic Beasts somewhere to find them.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I was reading into that, and I was just reading into Harry Potter because I just recently reread all the books because I'm a crazy person. Um, it struck me. They said that Daniel Radcliffe basically said, "Yeah, I know they're eventually going to remake these movies, and if they do, I'd like to play James Potter." And that was funny, but at the same time, I was saying, don't make these movies because you have this beautiful medium right here that you're clearly thriving on with Game of Thrones. Do it like that.
Hmm.
Do a Game of Thrones style adaptation. And I actually looked this up because I really was passionate about this, that Time Warner Cable owns Warner Brothers and HBO, so there's not even a rights issue. There's a nice clean way to do that. So, hey, Time Warner, get on it. Listen to this
This is your plug.
video. Yeah, that's my plug.
I think another interesting trend too, Game of Thrones, actually, really, I guess it's sort of Lord of the Rings, but like bringing fantasy to the public's eye. Like now it's okay to like fantasy. It's not seen as like a nerdy thing,
Hmm.
Like look at all the like bro dude kind of characters that love Game of Thrones, and watch it religiously every week.
Yeah.
And I think you even see the same thing with science fiction, and I don't really know why that is. I can't pinpoint a certain series that this is what brought science fiction like to the public, But now you have stuff like Interstellar, which is Christopher Nolan, big name thing, making a big sci-fi movie, and now all of a sudden everybody and their uncle is interested in seeing it, whereas before it would only be this sort of niche, nerdy,
Right.
perceived, geeky audience.
Yeah,
So
sci-fi is a little bit harder to pin down, and I'm interested to see how that actually happened. The best, just this is me just spitballing off the top of my head. I could be completely wrong about this, but if I were to trace it back to maybe Nolan's Batman movies.
I was gonna say either that or even like the Marvel stuff, like the Marvel films building until the Avengers, and even like superheroes. Like that wasn't a cool thing
Yeah.
for the public to be into.
And I think those are grounded a lot less in fantasy. Those are more
Yeah,
for the
but they,
most
they
part
do
we've been.
definitely overlap though with fantasy and sci-fi
Oh yeah,
too.
they definitely overlap, but I think that Iron Man and Batman specifically are grounded in enough science and tech that you could argue that those were the
Right.
sci-fi movies that sort of normalized geeky sci-fi, and the J.J. Abrams Star Trek. Glad I remembered
Oh
that
yeah,
too.
that's
That
probably
was
the one
another one
actually.
that probably had a
Hmm.
huge impact on normalizing sci-fi.
Yeah, that's an interesting trend, and I'm happy about it because I'm a big sci-fi buff. So I mean,
Yeah, as someone who grew up loving all of this crap, and now that it's all normal, it's awesome because now I can reliably have the things I want in movie theaters all the time. It's fantastic.
and you're getting the budget behind it to make them good, so you don't have to deal with cheesy,
Oh
you
God,
know,
yeah.
or worry about something just being bad. I was gonna say real quick, just wrapping up the sci-fi fantasy thing. I think Stephen King also has a lot to do with that in terms of making sort of pulpy fiction good and digestible and appeal to a wide enough audience.
Hmm.
So I'm sure this started way back when and has just sort of been building.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was actually reading an interview with Stephen King a couple days ago, and he was saying how basically he gets frustrated at the idea of horror and sci-fi and fantasy stuff not being considered real art. And he was
Hmm.
saying he's glad now that people saying, "Oh, well, what you're writing is still books. It's still literature. It's not like cheesy,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah, and in some cases, it's even
garbage."
required reading for schools now. I know I had to read The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon for high school, and in college, when I took a creative writing course, the book that was required was On Writing, which was written by Stephen King.
I read that in high school too, actually.
Even Roger Ebert said that whether or not you like Stephen King's works, On Writing is like the definitive source for like just good sense writing. Is the word I'm looking for. Instruction,
Right.
that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
So
he is very good. He's very talented. One other point I do want to mention, just because I just mentioned, oh, this is the stuff I grew up with, and I'm glad it's normalizing. I'm amazed at how much right now there's a lot of like sequels and reboots going on for stuff that we saw when we were kids.
hmm.
Because it seems like every movie that was a hit in at the time when we were people who were born in the 80s or 90s. I was born in 92, just for anyone watching who doesn't know how old I am. they're definitely catering back towards us to the point where they're making sequels and rebooting things that are clearly stuff that we grew up on.
Yeah, and that might also have to do with people in who grew up with that stuff as well are now in the industry and can push,
Right.
like, oh, I like this for personal reasons,
Right.
you know.
Well, the thing that's coming up to my mind, I'm referring a lot to Toy Story, and that they made Toy Story in '95 and '97 or '8. I forget when Toy Story 2 came out, and they revisit it 10 years later with Toy Story 3. That was clearly catering to us, to
Hmm.
people that had grown up with it as kids, and
And
now
was leaving
saying
for college.
get them back. Yeah, exactly. And I'm just seeing a whole bunch of these franchises that are basically rebooting and saying, "Hey, look how '90s kids remember all of this. It's back now."
It's like BuzzFeed, but
Oh God,
in your
yeah. Well,
whatever.
they even announced recently. This is not movie related at all, but they're re-releasing Surge, the soda from the '90s,
Really?
because yeah, they just read that just came out again. Because I saw it all over my Facebook. As people are like, oh, it's my childhood all over again. So there's definitely not even in movies, just in general, people are realizing that
Nostalgia pandering,
yeah,
sort
that's
of.
absolutely what it is.
Well, I think it's also interesting that like Twin Peaks is coming back now.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Oh yeah, I saw
recently
that. I saw that.
recently announced, and I think that it also has a lot to do with Twin Peaks just came out at the wrong time. That
Mm-hmm.
was way before any of this bizarre horror science fiction esque, arguably, stuff was mainstream and serialized, and people weren't ready for it. And now we're more than ready for it. People have caught up over, via Netflix or whatever over the years and have demanded a third season, and now we're getting it, which I think is pretty incredible and really inspiring for the future, I
Yeah,
guess, for what it could mean. I know there's people still holding on to like a Firefly reboot sort of thing.
I'm one of those people.
I have admittedly still not watched specifically for that reason. So
It'll tear you apart.
I don't want to turn, so I haven't watched it.
Yeah, and then also another one just like that. Not that as much as it came out the wrong time, but Veronica Mars just got
Yeah.
what was it, about a year ago, and announced that they got a
Hmm.
Kickstarter to make their own movie now.
Yeah, crowdfunding is an interesting. That's worthy of a whole other discussion. But yeah, it's the ability for the public to demand what content they want to see if they're willing to pay for it, and that's it's a good thing, and I think it can also be a bad thing.
Yeah, that's sort of, I think, also a lot of what Netflix is trying to do too, with realizing the stuff that people really liked and can't see, which is why we got a fourth season of Arrested Development.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Same thing. There's so many patterns here.
Man, we're breaking down walls here. We're
I
like
know.
masters of the 2010s, whatever this decade is.
2010s, whatever the hell we grew up. I don't know how we wrap these things up. If we've
Well, I guess
reviews, blogs that review anything.
gaming, and then the sort of this is the first introduction into sort of just philosophy about film and video games and culture. So more of that hopefully to come on my channel, Nerdy Inc.,